coming. Hi to everyone on the live stream. So we're so excited to have Claire and Rachel here to celebrate Claire's incredible novel, The Garden. But before we get started, I wanted to point out some logistics. So I'm Bella, I'm on the events team here at Phillips Magic. And first thing is, if you need to use the restroom, it's right here next to the Moleskins. We'll be doing a hand-raised Q&A towards the end of the discussion, so start thinking of questions. And then after the talk tonight, Claire will be signing and personalizing books at the table next to where you checked in. And we'll let you know where to line up for that. And then if you're joining us virtually on the YouTube live stream, we'd love to encourage you to buy a copy of the book in the link in the live stream description. That was a hard tongue twister. Okay. So The Garden, this is one of the best premises I've ever heard, and it truly delivers. I love this quote from Kelly Link. She says, "The garden renders beautifully the uncanny haunted space that pregnancy both occupies and creates. Beam's glancing needle-prick prose reminds me of Shirley Jackson's work in its ability to conjure up women, their histories, their fears, the complexity of their desires, and their power." So I just love that. I had to share. So Claire Beams is the author of the novel The Illness Lesson and the story collection We Show What We Have Learned, and which won the Bard Prize and was a Kirkus Best Debut 2016, as well as a finalist for the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize, the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award, and the Shirley Jackson Award. With her husband and 2 daughters, she lives in Pittsburgh, where she teaches creative writing, most recently at Carnegie Mellon University and the Pittsburgh Center for the Arts. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the incredible Rachel Lyon joins Claire in conversation tonight, and please buy her book as well. We have it up at the front. Rachel is the author of the novel Self-Portrait with a Boy, a finalist for the Center for Fiction's 2018 First Novel Prize, and Fruit of the Dead. Rachel's short work has appeared in One Story, The Rumpus, Electric Literature's Recommended Reading, and elsewhere. She has taught creative writing at various institutions, most recently Bennington College, and now lives with her husband and 2 young children in Western Massachusetts. So please join me in welcoming Claire and Rachel.
Hello. So I want, first of all, just to say thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much to Books Are Magic for having me. I've always wanted to have an event here. And Rachel, thank you so much for doing this conversation with me. Rachel is brilliant, and Fruit of the Dead is such a beautiful book. It's this retelling of the Persephone myth that you kind of like I sort of almost lost track of how many very cool things you were doing with all the layers of that myth, because I was just so into the story of the longing of this character that you were telling. I mean, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous book. So I'm very honored to be talking to you today.
And now we can all go home. So are you going to read to us?
Yes, I think I'll read to you just like the first 2 pages or so of the book. So, and also since I'm assuming almost no one has read the book yet, this is my Pregnancy as a Haunted House novel. So it's the premises were set in the late 1940s, and there's an isolated country house turned hospital where a husband and wife doctor team is trying out an experimental new cure for repeated miscarriage. And our protagonist is Irene, who's their sort of like prickliest and most difficult patient, but she's also very desperate and very pregnant. So she's sort of stuck in this house, following these rules very grudgingly that the doctors are giving her, and meanwhile kind of like poking around and doing lots of things she's not supposed to do. And through doing that, finds this abandoned walled garden that seems to have powers of its own. And as the doctor's plans start kind of going awry, she has to figure out what if anything she's going to do with this garden. Okay, so I will read you just the first few pages before most of that has actually occurred. The house held still, and behind it the garden rested, brown turning green. Doctor and Doctor, Mr. and Mrs. came out onto the steps to watch the approach. They did this when they could. Welcome made a difference. Without turning to him, she said, "Remember not to talk too much," as if he ever did or could or wanted to when she was there. George and Irene drove toward the house that held their future and saw the Doctor and Doctor standing at the top of the main stair, right in the maw of the gaping door. That was the way things looked to Irene: the steps, the tongue, the portico, the brow, the facade, the wide marble face. George slowed the car just enough, Irene feared, to be noticed. "Jesus," he said, "what is this place? Why are they watching us like that?" "Speed up, they'll think we're afraid of them." "Really, we are." Fear wasn't the feeling Irene had been aware of before this moment, but as the car neared and Irene kept an eye on the doctors, waiting for them to move, she understood that all along she'd been imagining a hospital, like the one where they'd met these doctors the first time. Instead, it seemed she had to face the mammoth patient creature of this house, which was stationary, yes, but stationary like a living thing, holding still on purpose only until it could take her inside. Look, even its arms were extended, 2 long wings angled in, ready to close. And she had to face these complimentary doctors, too, fixed as the statues that flank entries. If it were Irene standing there with the woman doctor, the match would be nearer. You look alike a little, did you notice? George had said to her after their first appointment. Irene had noticed only that feeling of hard-to-place familiarity that makes a person ask, do I know you from somewhere? The doctor's eyes weighed, and Irene wondered how clearly they could see her and George through the windshield, and if the doctors could read lips. You're really going to leave me here? She said to George, trying not to move her mouth much. She meant it to sound playful, but to be here, they had both pedaled themselves. George's forehead gathered. No, it's all right, Irene said. They were close enough now to see smiles rising to the doctors' faces. George stopped the car and came around to Irene's door with the rollicking gait she loved. She put her hand in his so he could help her out. Every time he stewarded her lately, he seemed to be rubbing her face in his stupid hope when she had enough of her own. She climbed forth. She touched the slippery rose-colored fabric of her new maternity suit. This was the color she'd wanted right away from the catalog's many choices, warm and bloomy. Good morning, the woman doctor called and descended the stairs to press George and Irene's joined hands. George broke his grip then to reach up the stairs and greet the man doctor, still a few steps up as if sealing some bargain. How was the drive? Asked the woman doctor. I tried to take the corners slow for her stomach, said George. What a good sign, the woman doctor said. Irene peered into her face. Not a perfect mirror, no. Something similar about their chins and the hard set of their mouths, the lift of their eyebrows, but this woman's eyes were blue, where Irene's were wheat-colored, and Irene's hair was darker. And, of course, the doctor was older, too. How old? Older than Irene's own age, 28, but much younger, she thought, than her mother. In that middle territory, what happened to a childless woman? Irene had begun finding out for herself. Kitchens and bedrooms and living rooms full of screaming quiet. Sun on carpets, rain on doorsteps, quiet so loud she could hear nothing else. But she wondered if for this woman doctor it might be different. Very promising, said the man doctor. He had charm, but there wasn't much to wonder about him. The doctors led the Willards up. Stairs brought out the sluggish drag of the weight at Irene's center, and even here she didn't like this awareness, which had never led anywhere good before. Her body had over and over proven itself a liar. She'd started to suspect this might just be a new uncovering of a trait it had always had. As they fed themselves in, one by one, Irene had time to notice that up close the marble of the house was in fact veined like skin. And I'll stop there.
It's such a good beginning, and it sets up so well this sort of like breathing, maternal environment of the house, which is a phrase that keeps coming up in the book, the maternal environment. So Irene is the maternal environment, and yet she's also in this maternal environment that is this maybe haunted house.
Yes.
So I love, first of all, I love the book, and everyone is more than welcome to buy 10,000 copies.
That would be great.
I highly
solve a lot of problems.
But I wanted to start by asking you about your research process for the book. I know you, so I have to look at the pronunciation, excuse me. So diethylstilbestrol.
Yeah, diethylstilbestrol, I think. Or at least that's what I've arrived on. Yes.
Okay, great. So tell us about your encountering of this drug and how it sort of led you to this book.
Sure. So I was actually researching, so for my previous novel, The Illness Lesson, there was a time where we were thinking about changing the title, but no one had any ideas about what a better title would be. It was just like we don't necessarily love it. So go see if you can find something that we love more. And so I was poking around in all these weird corners of the medical internet, trying to figure out if there was something that would work. And I came across a reference to this drug called diethylstilbestrol, or DES, which was not a drug that I had heard of before. And it was prescribed in this country from the the early 40s actually through the early 70s. And it, I guess actually the late 40s through the early 70s, but it was pioneered by a husband and wife doctor team, and it was a very high dose of an artificial estrogen. And their thinking was that they had noticed in their research that women's hormones swing around the time of miscarriage. And so they thought if they could just even that out, that everything would be better. And that idea caught me right away, because I think so often when we talk about evening women out, something scary is coming. And it turned out that, in fact, this drug is like a really bad idea. And it causes, it's often referred to as the silent thalidomide. So thalidomide being the drug that was prescribed for morning sickness, I believe, that caused very visible birth defects in the children of the women who took it. And this drug, instead of causing anything visible, often caused malformations of the female sexual organs of the children of the women who took this drug. But it wasn't clear until puberty a lot of the time. And then even after the first generation of girls reached puberty, this drug was still prescribed for years and years and years. And it also causes all these higher risks of terrible cancers. So I think that also caught me, this question of like, why was this such a slow and ongoing disaster? Like, why did that continue to happen? And so that was sort of the first spark. I am a very particular kind of historical fiction writer, in that I am never going to like tell you a lot about the curtains or spend, I don't research for 5 years before I start writing. I research actually a lot, but I do it as I'm going. And that's because the spark of it is never in like the furniture of the time period. And I also feel very free to take like the seed of fact and then kind of do what I want with it. So the real life researcher team, there was no like isolated creepy hospital where they were, trying this out on it. They just wove it right into their regular practice, which is in some ways also pretty horrifying. But I think in my work, it's often really advantageous to get people away from the real world so that the weirdest stuff can happen, because the world kind of wants to come in and stop it. So, yeah.
Right. So you started with this, the research for this drug, and which put you in a certain time period.
Yes, right.
Is that what determined your setting in 1948, or were there other factors too?
So I think that it was part of it. This really was when the first prescribing would have been done. But then I messed with so much, because they were not trying to rectify the maternal environment in these broader ways that there was no talk therapy. There was no, the doctors in my book do a lot of like, don't eat this, rest, don't walk around. And really that it was just, they were just giving this drug within their regular practice. So I certainly could have changed the setting too. I think that I found the idea of a character who would be there because her husband really wanted a baby very interesting. Irene is this very divisive character, very like prickly, difficult person, but her one softness is this like complete love for this husband that she thinks is just a much better person than she is, and he really wants a baby. And I think I was playing with this idea of like, he's been in the war and has come home with this desperate need to like do something else big but better this time, so he can stop thinking about all of the other terrible big stuff that's just happened to him. So I think that felt useful too, kind of like just after the war. Yeah.
It struck me too that like it's a really convenient time period in our history to start playing with ideas about gender and difference, and this is something that really comes up. So you mentioned actually in the reading, right? I love that you read this moment when George says to Irene, "You look a little bit alike, don't you?"
Yeah.
Did you notice that? So like there's this strange physical resemblance between Irene and one of the doctors,
Right.
Dr. Bishop. Which is just kind of there, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I find it so fascinating. And Dr. Bishop, you really resist like creating any kind of like classical antagonist in the book.
Yeah.
There's no bad guy.
Yeah.
But
Except the
that's-
grandfather ghost, who
Right.
is a pretty bad guy. He's like the patriarchy. Yeah, this is
It makes more sense when you read the book. Spoiler. He is amazing.
Thank you. It's fun to write.
I want to tell everyone all about him, but you just have to read it for yourself.
Yeah.
But so both Dr. Bishop
Yeah.
and Irene have this sort of anti-feminine feminism, right? So
Right.
not only do they look alike, but they're both kind of bucking against like
Yes.
traditional
Mm-hmm.
femininity in a
Right.
really interesting way, and they don't particularly like each other.
No, they really don't like each other. But there is this like weird psychic
Yeah.
sort of twinning kind of happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to talk to you about that
Yeah.
and like ask us, because in some ways it's not really explained.
No.
And in some
Yeah.
ways, like I was like, is this like a horror horror trope? Like in some ways, you're like it's a genre thing.
Yes,
right?
it is a genre thing.
Okay.
So that was, I definitely got excited when I realized I was using a trope and I could catch away with it. You know, that felt fun. But really, I think the reason for that mostly is that there was a version of this book. I wrote a lot of this novel while I was like in various versions of lockdown with my children, and so I was just so and I sold this novel as a partial, and so when I finally had like a full draft to turn in, I felt so proud and like excited. And then my agent and editor both read it, and then they talked to each other before they talked to me, which is never a great sign. Often, I don't know. It hasn't. In this case, it was like they had a big thing to say, and they wanted to like gauge how they should say it. I had written a draft in which that version of the book was almost evenly split in point of view between Irene and Dr. Bishop. And I had done that, I think, because I really didn't want Dr. Bishop to be just a villain. I actually really love her. And I think my villains are usually, I think this is true in The Illness Lesson too, like the bad guy of that novel, like my villains always are doing a lot of harm with really good intentions. Like the end is a noble, good end, and they just are so fixated on this end that they're not noticing what they're hurting through the means, you know? Yeah. And so I think with Dr. Bishop, I wanted to write her mostly because I wanted to show why she was doing what would otherwise look like these like quite terrible things to these patients. And I was just interested in her. I just thought that was like what would make somebody able to be in this position that the world like really didn't want them to have at that time in that place. But so I think sometimes as a writer, you have to write things that don't necessarily need to be in the book. And so as a result of, I really wanted to write a ghost story. And every time we were in Dr. Bishop's head, we were like looking behind the curtain of the ghost story. Yeah. I also had this impulse every time I was in her head, which is never a good sign for me, where I wanted to be like in backstory telling you why she had come to be doing what she was doing and why she was the way she was. And that's not the current story, right? That's sort of the stuff that I needed to know so that I felt like I was doing justice to her. But so I think the resemblance between them got exaggerated after I had cut her perspective. I think because I wanted Irene to have this kind of weird, uncanny, unexplained, and unexplainable, I think, access to the interior of this woman, maybe, or maybe she's just hallucinating too.
Yeah.
So,
well, it seems like she's right.
It seems like she's at least like yes. Yeah. I think she's mostly right, at least in like in the truth of it, like the real. Yeah.
I feel like another trope that's coming into play here is like this. Well, you have the black box of the unknown, right? Yeah. Which is happening in many different ways in the book. It's happening within the human body in a pregnancy. Yep. There's the Schrodinger's miscarriage issue.
Yes.
You never know whether the baby is alive or dead or not.
Yes, you do not. It's true. It's a terrible way to live. Yes.
And then there's also like all the unknowable functions of this house and this garden, right? So the garden that brings things back to life is a source of constant curiosity for Irene and her friends. And also for the reader.
Yes.
And becomes like their obsession, right? Where they're in this space where they have nothing else to do. Right. They're told to rest all of the time. They have very little to occupy their very active minds. Right. And so they keep coming to this space which seems to be maybe bringing things back to life. Right. So there's this question of the unknowable sort of like couched within another question of the unknowable.
Yes. Right.
Is this another in some ways, like the whole book is an extended metaphor for pregnancy, right? Yeah. Which is so cool. So is this another sort of horror trope that you're toying with, or so where did this concept come from for you?
I think that one came from life mostly. Yeah. I mean, I think like as a person who runs toward anxious, I did find pregnancy to be just this kind of like maddening state. And in each case, I have been pregnant 2 times and I have 2 daughters, which is like a very fortunate position to be in. But in each case, like they were able to see something on a scan that was not normal, but no one could tell us whether it was like a huge deal or not at all a big deal. And you kind of can't tell like what they're not telling you on purpose versus what they don't know. And then a lot of what we don't know about women's bodies generally, but maybe especially pregnant bodies, is like a lot of the not knowing has been on purpose for centuries. Because I think there's this way of thinking about women's bodies that has to do with sort of like squeamishness and also sacredness, where it's like we better not look too close at that because we might mess something up. Also gross. And also like certainly you wouldn't want to give the woman herself any like correct terminology for anything, because that would be just like bad for everyone involved. So I think that like feels like we are still very much recovering from that.
Yeah.
So like I felt like I was in this situation where I was handed some information with no meaning attached to it, really, where it was like, I mean, one doctor literally said to me, nature knows what it's doing. Does nature, like, sure, I guess for like nature's, purposes, but like what about my purposes? Like, I definitely have a like skin in the game here. So it was weird to be asked to sort of like sit with this question when you're also like living in such a deeply embodied way with this thing that is both separate from you, but like at your actual core. Yeah. So I feel like really, rather than like a horror trope, I feel like it was just like this is a weird thing that I will probably want to think about in some way someday.
Yeah.
So
I am so curious if you like feel like you write from a place of alternate realities or like anxiety, like where we all write from as fiction writers is always a source of curiosity to me.
Yes.
Like I feel like sometimes I'm writing from a place of like, well, what if the worst possible thing happened?
Yeah.
How bad would that be? Let's explore.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Is that part of what's going on for you?
I think that's a part of how my plots progress very much, is that like I start always from image. Like there's some image that's often connected with some sort of setting for me, and there's usually there actually always, I would say, some quality of the strange about whatever mental picture I have. And then I know that it's something I want to write about when I start thinking about how I could put it into words. And only then do I start thinking about like who I could put in conversation with that kind of like verbalized picture. And then I start thinking about like who would this be worst for? Because that's usually like when you're in the best territory in fiction. It's like who would this be uniquely problematic for? And that's my person. And then the plot is just sort of like, and let's make it worse and worse and worse until it can't get worse in that direction anymore, and then we have to see what has happened instead. But it always, so like I feel like I'm coming at it in this way that does not at all feel autobiographical, and yet it always turns out that at the end I'm like, oh, so that's what I think about that from my own life. So like I think that while it does feel certainly, I mean, I'm always writing books where almost always writing books where there's something that's at least a little impossible that's happening, or at least a little hyper real or pulled on or stretched. But it always turns out that that's like in order to explore an extremely real emotional dynamic from my own life. I just don't know that until I get to the end of the book.
Yeah. I really love the characters. Like, Irene is such a delightful person to follow around.
I love her so much, and people do not. Some people do not.
It's so hard to believe. She's so feisty.
She's also like, who
fun.
wouldn't be angry in this situation? Yes. Like, I didn't even think I was writing an especially angry character. I just thought, like, how would I feel if this were my life?
Yeah.
Not good.
Yeah.
And then I think, I don't know, it became, I think, very important to the book that she be not a rule follower, because I do think otherwise this would have been a book that was entirely about waiting, and there's already so much waiting to negotiate. Like I had to print out a calendar of 1948 and plot all the pregnancies, and then there are these, as the book progresses, there are these like significant 3-day periods where the garden like is or isn't doing something. They want to determine how it's gone, and so like just making all that work time-wise was a big mess. But if all I had was, it would have been a very static book if Irene had not been so feisty.
So feisty and so imaginative. I mean, part of like where I had a teacher in grad school who said like the best thing you can give your characters is an imagination. I kept thinking of that as I was reading your book, because like Irene's imagination is going haywire. Like she really is like full of ideas. Plus she's so loved. Like she has this love for George, and he loves her, which really like anyone who, I can't believe anybody doesn't like her, but like I would imagine that anyone who didn't like her initially would be convinced by this like lovely relationship that she
well, seemingly not, but that's not my problem.
It's true. It's true.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, speaking of teachers, about like, I know you're a teacher, creative writing.
Yeah.
How you feel like if your own teaching and teaching writers has affected your work.
That's so interesting. I mean, so the teaching that I started out doing, I actually, I taught ninth graders for 6 years, and I took that job because I had finished with my MFA, and I was not writing anything good yet, and so I knew I needed a job while I figured out how to be better at what I actually wanted to do. So I was like, I'll be done at 2:30 every day. I can write so much, which was very incorrect, but I also had not really understood how much I would love my students, because I had really not loved being a ninth grader at all, really had not. And so I sort of assumed I would like 2 of them. And then it just is amazing when you're the adult how transparent everything is in this way that makes them just so, just every one of them sort of captures your heart in a certain way, because they're so in formation, and they're so, so many of the not so lovely things they do to each other because it's so clearly coming from this place of something that shitty that happened to them, so I just I don't know, I think that teaching in general, I think it was almost how I finished growing up in a certain way. I think it gave me a lot to think about in terms of the ways that we relate to each other and shape each other as we move through the world. And then the teaching that I'm doing now, actually, and I have a former student here from, I'm teaching for a low-res MFA program, the Randolph MFA program, which is wonderful. And that teaching is just, it feeds my writing, because it's also so it's not a full-time job, but it is my most favorite teaching that I have yet been able to do, because you get to know, you have 3 students generally, and they send you work once a month, and you read it, and you can write all over it. I'm kind of an overworker, and I can't overwork so much that it gets in the way of my own work, because I can write to my heart's content and still not use up all the time, because there's only 3 of them. And then you get to have these long conversations with them where you're really invited into their process. And all the time in the course of those conversations, things come up that, I think are helpful to them, but that also get me thinking. So, I mean, I think that teaching is a great job for a writer. It is I do think both of those jobs will take all the time that you will give them, and so that is the one, time-wise is the one, that's the one trick, is figuring out where to put those hours so that you still get to your own stuff.
Yeah.
But I do find that it's also just such a good antidote to, on a day of writing that's not so great, what I do is I write 3 paragraphs that I'm probably going to delete the next day, and you can start to be why is this what I am doing with my life? This is me in the world, this is what I thought the world needed, and teaching, I think, it can go well, it can go badly, but you never feel like you didn't do anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah. And it's so intimate,
yes.
Right? You have such a relationship with another person's mind, I think, in a way that you never get to do in any other capacity.
That's really true. Yeah. And that's so much fun to to get to sort of spitball about somebody else's creative work is really fun.
Yeah, it's cool.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if we have questions from the audience, but before I go to the audience, I do want to ask you one last thing, which is sort of, so this is your second book.
Yeah. Yes, it's actually my 3rd book and my 2nd novel.
Your second novel.
Yes. It's me.
The illness lesson. So between the illness lesson and this book, we were just talking before we started about how your most recent book is always your favorite.
Yes.
And you hate whatever. Well, in my experience, I always hate my own work. Don't read it.
Yes.
No, nobody read it.
Yeah.
So have you seen a kind of? Do you see a sort of a narrative from one book to the next, and how did the first inform the second, and are you working on anything new informed by these first 2?
So I've noticed about myself, and again, this is something that I often understand after I have done it, but I'm often writing about a life stage or 2 back from where I am. So I feel my children who are sitting in the back are 11 and 7 now, and so I'm not I'm just now beginning to write about parenthood, not parenthood of them specifically. They will be pleased to know. But I felt when I was starting this book, which I started this book kind of as soon as developmental edits for the illness lesson were done. So I was still doing copy edits for the illness lesson and sort of just beginning to feel around in the dark of this book. And so I was not yet ready. They were at that time, 2 and 5 or 6. And so I don't think I was yet really ready to think about parenthood, but I was, I think, finally ready to think about pregnancy. you know, which is also like in so many ways some of the stuff that made me nuts about pregnancy. Like your child is born and then you never know anything again. It's like you're not with them some of the time. Anything could be happening to them, and also you don't have access to their interior lives, on which like so much depends. You know, but so I think, you know, this is a novel that like is about pregnancy, but is also about some of the stuff that carries over, I think, from pregnancy into parenthood. And so I have noticed that like I'm often writing a little bit back, you know, in time in terms of like what the actual real emotional dynamic is that I want to think about. And then actually the book that I'm working on now kind of breaks that. Oh no, it doesn't, because it's about parenthood, but then it's also about a place of my childhood. So it's very early days. But it's also very different for me, and I think it's going to be longer than my other books, and it's set in kind of the near future. But I am from Newtown, Connecticut, and was actually pregnant with my older daughter when the school shooting there happened in 2012. And my parents had moved, but I lived there from the age of 6 until I graduated from high school. So that was like the setting of my childhood. And it was a very particular kind of childhood where we were like very bored, but in this kind of like nothing ever happens kind of way. Like it was a very lucky place to be a kid. And so to be like on the precipice of parenthood, and I'd like just started being able to feel her move. And then it was like this parade of very small children's faces. And I do think it did like a psychic number on me. As someone who was always going to find parenthood kind of like whoa, this is quite a bargain I have undertaken here. Like bringing this thing into my life that like I'm not quite sure I would be okay if anything bad happened to it. You know? Like that's a risky thing. It's like, here's my whole heart just like walking around the world forever. Great. You know? So I think, so I'm setting, this novel it's about a mother of a 5-year-old, and it's set in a fictionalized Newtown. And there's a lot of ghosts and kind of explore, because Newtown, like a lot of messed up things happen in Newtown. Like the murder that the movie Fargo, like the wood chipper murder episode is based on. Has anybody seen the movie of Fargo? And there's their own show, and I don't know if they did the wood chipper thing, but there was an airline pilot in the 80s who killed his stewardess wife in their house and thought that if he disposed of her body, he couldn't be convicted. So he put her through the wood chipper and scattered her in the pond. And it was Connecticut's first conviction of so like this house was like, you know, in Newtown. And there was also like in the 1800s, it was the center of Danbury and Newtown were sort of the center of the hat making industry of that region. And so there were a lot of people that like went totally crazy from the mercury. And there's still a Hattertown Road, and it's like you can drive down and think about all of the messed up stuff that happened there. So, and there's a lot of stuff like this in the town. And so my main character has a sort of, she has a kind of clairvoyance that lets her access some of this.
Oh, it sounds so good, Claire.
Thank you. I hope I can, I don't know. I mean, I think it's good to feel this way, but I'm not sure I'm up to it yet, so we'll see, you know? Like, I don't know if I'm capable of what I have envisioned. So
it sounds like a great project for you. And like a beautiful, I mean, in some ways the black box idea that you're sort of exploring here, right? Like it sounds like it translates really beautifully to this new project.
Thank you.
Well. So yes, let's ask some audience questions. Does anybody want to get us started? Yeah.
Longtime Clare Beans fan.
This is my dear friend Carrie.
But I'm noticing that from book to book to book, both your main characters and also their environments are getting more unruly. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering about how those two maybe facilitate each other, or is that you letting yourself get weird? Like what's going on there?
Well, so I mean, I do think discovering the weird for myself as a writer was like completely crucial for me, and it was something that happened like 3 years after grad school had ended, because I was writing all through grad school these very careful, very realist. I was really afraid of failing, I think, and so I was trying to write like a good story, and I was trying to do that by like holding the whole thing very tightly. And so I wrote these like very pancakey, dead realist stories in which, like, you know, a family tensely has dinner and something is wrong, but they will not say what it is, and then like a dog barks in the distance, and then like end scene, you know, they don't want to write the so like 3 years out, I just like I had this strange idea for a story that was unlike anything I had ever written before, and it felt like I got excited thinking about the idea because it felt like it felt like playing You know, and I was like, I don't write this kind of story. And then I was like, whatever, I don't have to show it to anyone. I'm just going to write it. And then it was like so much fun. And so I think that like weirdness for me is connected to play, which is like a strange word for what I think is actually very serious work. But it's like, what I mean by that is that I have to be in a space of not thinking about whether it's like successful. Does that make sense? Like I have to be just feeling like I'm messing around and seeing what I can do. And strangeness of some kind seems to be totally crucial to that feeling for me. And I think, I do think probably I am getting more unruly because I also just think like the world is bad. It's just not great. And it's sort of steadily, you know, and I like also, I think growing up was in this, you know, I was born in 1982. So like the messaging for a lot of my childhood was like, here are a bunch of problems that we have fixed. Like, isn't that nice? Like feminism was great. We resolved that for you. Like we've resolved, you know, all these terrible things that, you know, it was bad once. Aren't we lucky now? We all want, you know, I think I then became a grown up and I was like, this doesn't feel like I thought it would. You know, I just think life is very unruly and weird. And so I think to like catch the emotional truth of what living actually feels like, probably my books are getting weirder too.
Do we have another question?
I haven't read it yet, and I'm very excited, and it's gone to the top of my to-read pile. But I've just been, you know, looking at the cover a lot for this during now. So I'm wondering if you can say it's such a beautiful book, and so I'm wondering if you can say anything.
Well, conveniently, my cover designer is back there.
Oh.
It was a genius. It was my cover designer for each the past 2 books. So, well done. Yes.
He just told me I stole his question.
Yes. And that is the thing I hear all the time is that my book's covers are perfect, which I completely agree. And I had so much anxiety going into the cover experience with Doubleday because I just didn't know, like I was sending my editor all these pictures of like what my books must not look like, especially I was starting, you know, The Illness Lesson is set in the 1890s. And so I had this vision. I think every author has some version of this. I had like a nightmare vision of what the cover of my book could be. And it was a woman in like a Civil War era ball gown with her back turned and some green fields. And I was like, I just like anyone who picked up that book, you know, thinking it was, that cover would just be such a false promise for what the contents of the book are. And then Emily sent me to the website of this artist, Michelle Kingdom, who is an embroidery artist who embroiders like almost exclusively creepy groups of women and girls in like natural settings. And I was like, yes, all of them. Can we put them all on the cover? And then you did it again for this book because I think, I don't know, I'm always like the words I keep using for covers that feel like they could fit my books are this like creepy pretty thing, but the creepy is very important and I'm always worried we're gonna miss that. Like I would be much happier to miss the pretty than to miss the creepy, you know? Like and yet somehow like, so yeah, this flower uterus, like who knew that was there, but there's an artist out there building many of them and photographing them. And we're now kind of like social media friends too. She keeps like chiming in and saying like, yay! But yeah, I mean, I think cover art is such a like, it's its own, because I don't know, I mean, it's like, it's a marketing tool, which is, you know, I think for the publisher, it's the most important job, but for the writer, it's also like your child's face forever, right? So it has to fit like something about the feeling of what you were doing. Fruit of the Dead has a beautiful cover too. Yeah. Yes. It's
There's
gorgeous.
2 beautiful covers.
Yeah. I don't think I've seen the other one. Okay. It's out there. Okay.
Yes, another question.
So I haven't read the book yet, just got it, but you know, I was reading the New York Times review of it, and also New York Times, many
liked that
stories
review very much.
about very awesome review, but obviously, you know, in the Times, just news about abortion and
Yeah.
news about what's going on with women's rights or lack thereof, and I'm just curious about if any of your process included kind of thinking about the current events of the day.
You know what's so weird is both times I've written a novel, like there's something like a new horrible shift that happens like basically when I'm done. So like,
So you were
like,
causing
yeah, I don't know. I'm messing something up, I think. But like, so I mean, this book was mostly written by the time the most extreme recent stuff has been happening, which is crazy to think about. I mean, there's also a really beautiful book from 2018 called Red Clocks. Has anybody read that? So great, Lainey Zumas. And it's like where we are. It's like basically fetuses have been given personhood, and then all of the sort of the trickle down effects of that, which are all terrible, basically. So I mean, I think that like there's a lot of, it's weird. I mean, I think I never set out to consciously put any kind of current event in my books, but I think obviously this stuff is all like out there in the ether in ways that we're picking up without realizing it, you know, that you're kind of like sensing it in the air. And then I think when you go, you know, often in fiction, like I'm going to some weird place that's like a sort of concentration of a dynamic that I've sensed from somewhere. And so I think it's like by going to those more extreme places, sometimes you kind of seem like you're predicting the future because in fact you've just sensed where we're already headed, you know. But yeah,
And your next protagonist is a clairvoyant. So.
yeah, so who knows? Yeah.
Autobiographical, maybe.
Definitely.
Is there a question back there? Can I see a hand? Well, it's such a masterful book, Claire, and it's just like our little group that we're part of was crowning Clare Queen Shirley Jackson. Like it's true, like you've inherited like this incredible title. So I'll forever think of you as Queen Shirley Jackson. And this book it's just so beautiful and also so creepy and such a delightful read. It's really just so full of ideas and also so fun.
Thank
at
you.
the same time.
I
So
really appreciate it.
everyone's got to go buy a copy right now, and Claire will be signing some.
Yes, I will.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, so just really quickly, if you're still with us on the live stream, please click the link in the description and buy a copy of the book. And then for those of us still in person, we have additional copies available at the table where you signed in. And then Claire will be signing and personalizing out the alcove where my coworker Joanne is about to point right here. So that's where we'll have you line up. And we also have copies of Rachel's book as well, Fruit of the Dead, so please buy that.
It's so good. Everyone should buy it.
Yeah, agreed. And thank you so much for coming. And thank you to both of you for
Thank you
being
so
with
much
us.
for having us.